So this week, we're going to be talking about the golden ratio Fibonacci sequence still life lecture. With its origins in the Middle ages in ancient Greco-Roman art, still life painting emerged as a distinct genre and professional specialization in Western paintings by the late 16th century, and has remained significant since then. Keep in mind that a still life form gives the artist more freedom in the arrangement of elements within a composition than do paintings of other types of subjects, such as a landscape or portraiture. Remember, throughout this time, when we're looking at our lectures for specific assignments, what I want you to keep in mind from some of the examples we'll start to see from students' work from what we're looking at here, excuse me, gives you an example of really what is potentially possible through this assignment, specifically the arrangement of our objects from home. Ideally, they should be personal, right? They should have meaning. They should have some sort of relationship to you, the artist, the person who actually collects the objects themselves. In terms of our learning objectives, students will understand the golden ratio, which is the 1 to 1.618, also known as the Fibonacci sequence. And I'll get into exactly calculating these sort of equations on our picture plane, which was discussed before in our previous assignment. Students will identify the differences between a gesture and contour drawing, how to create an ellipse, eye level, and cross-contour line. This is really important because they're sort of identifying what is a gesture, what is a contour drawing, what's an ellipse, how do you calculate an ellipse, right? What is eye level from an object, depending on where you are from your picture plane, and then also what is cross-contour, right? An emphasis on structure within the relationship and arrangement of objects by using various charcoal techniques will be explored. Remember, we're kind of getting away from graphite. We're done with graphite. We're not going to use that for this assignment specifically. Those of you who are interested in applying a grid, I will show you how to do that with a set of graphite because it's a lot easier. But really, the main focus for this assignment is a transition to charcoal, specifically Willow and Compress, which we'll talk a little bit about. Students will understand the variety of contrast and value when using charcoal to successfully depict the illusion of three-dimensional form and space. Now, you can kind of see here, some of the examples from previous quarters gives more of obviously context, but an idea of how light is also a key factor throughout this specific assignment. On our first assignment with the linear perspective drawings, value was not really key, was not really a main focus. Now, in our still lifes, it is. It's actually our primary focus. Again, we have, in terms of our materials, we have our Strathmore 14 by 17 or 18 by 24 inch drawing paper pads, 80 pounds only. We have our Willow and compressed charcoals, as well as our kneaded and white erasers. And then the option, if you need a grid, you need obviously a ruler, and I will show you how to do that in the demo. Let's talk a little bit about this sort of image we're looking at here. Now, this is interesting because throughout art and design, we have seen this form in terms of this equation or this sort of spiral of a shell repeated throughout design and as well as the art world. Mathematically speaking, the golden ratio is a ratio of 1 to 1.618, which is also known as the golden number in art and design, creating an aesthetically pleasing image through balance and harmony. Right. And this is interesting because when we're looking at this, it starts in the beginning here and sort of spirals out to the end of this picture plane. And we'll talk a little bit about how do you use this ratio 1 to 1.618 on our actual drawing papers? Because the golden ratio relates to the number 1.618. In mathematical terms, it is sort of considered as an irrational number, meaning that it has an endless series of digits that don't repeat and cannot be expressed as a single fraction. Talk a little bit more about calculating this. The mathematical concept of the golden ratio originated around 500 BC, before Common Era. Some credit Greek scholars like Euclid or Pythagoras within honing it specifically. But really, the pioneer from this golden ratio of what we now look at in terms of the text itself, in terms of the Fibonacci sequence of numbers, or also known as the golden number or golden ratio, is Leonardo Pisano Fibonacci. Born around 1170 to 1240, was an Italian number theorist. He introduced the world to such wide-ranging mathematical concepts as what is now known as the Arabic numbering system, the concept of square roots, and even word problems. Before, what we've now adopted from the Arabic numbering system was Roman numerals, XV, 1, so on and so forth, right? Imagine reading that nowadays, which would be kind of fascinating to think about. Now, the Fibonacci sequence, or sort of sequence, is a series of numbers. Let me get Jasper in here, in which each number is the sum of the two that preceded. Starting at 0 and 1, the sequence looks like this specifically. So it starts off with 0, 0 to 1 will be 1, right? 1 to 1 will be 2, 2 to 1 will be 3, 2 to 3 will be 5, 3 to 5 will be 8, 5 and 8 will be 13, 8 and 13 will be 21, and then so on, ever and ever. Okay. This is interesting because when we look at these series of numbers, we'll start to look at how in which we can actually calculate these sort of irrational numbers in order to create a harmonious balance composition. This goes back to the rule of thirds, which is a general guideline for how to create an interesting composition, which states that any image, painting, photograph, graphic design should be broken into a grid with a vertical and two horizontal lines, creating 9 equally proportioned boxes. And why would you do this? And the question kind of going back to this concept is sort of familiar to us now, but you have to sort of think about it throughout art history. Artists are intentionally being really mindful, really considerate to sort of concentrate of exactly what are their main key features in the painting or their works of art specifically. The anatomy lesson from Dr. Nicholas Tulp by Rembrandt is a great example of sort of the high Baroque period in Dutch, or I should say the golden era, Dutch landscape era, which is sort of a period from the Northern Baroque in terms of the Netherlands. But Rembrandt himself is really methodically cautious, but also sort of wise to sort of indicate the rule of thirds in this painting from what we're looking at on the slide. If you can see here, in order to then sort of calculate, how do you get sort of these horizontal lines, right? As well as these vertical lines that meet at these intersections. Notice where they actually meet from Dr. Nicholas Tulp here, who's sort of performing a sort of a autopsy right in front of his medical students in terms of sort of being a more sort of a modern citizen in the Netherlands. You can see here the central key focuses are the sort of the corpse here in the foreground, also sort of one of the medical students' head, Dr. Nicholas Tulp's head, as well as his sort of similar to where his hands as well as his gesture of his body is, right, in terms of his placement of his body. All of it is sort of drawing our eyes into those sort of central key points, right? Now, if we looked at this as a landscape, what's the most important line in a landscape? A horizon line. Notice if we have our rule of thirds, you then can sort of place your horizontal line here or here. If it was in the middle, it would sort of be off balance, right? It would be too evenly in the center. If it was too high up here, it would same thing. And then same thing from down here. If there was a horizontal line here that separated land and water, it wouldn't make any sort of balance or harmony. Now, in order to calculate this, you would actually take your ruler, measure out your sort of picture plane, your edges. For this case, we'll measure out 18 by 24, and you will multiply it to 0.618. And I'm going to show you how to do this in the demo, and specifically to sort of see how the important significance of sort of creating this composition balance in terms of your harmony of your still life is key. And this is what I want us to sort of focus on. It could be much more dynamic. It could be much more interesting from its subject matter, but you're really trying to draw in your viewer's eye across the actual scene of the work. Excuse me. Let's look at another example of techniques artists in the early Renaissance, but also even way before what we now look at in terms of a modern camera, of using the camera obscura, which is a sort of an ancestor from the photographic camera. The Latin word or the Latin name means dark chamber. And in the earliest versions, dating to antiquity, consisted of a small darkened rooms with light emanated through a tiny single hole. You can kind of see here in this illustration gives you an idea of exactly how would an artist sort of create this sort of structure that's in the sort of landscape, then also being projected on the opposite wall through this tiny hole. The result was that the inverted image of the outside scene was cast on the opposite wall, which was then usually whitened, right? So it would be sort of inverted upside down, and have sort of a haze of white. This is where artists can then use on a larger scale, creating almost as a camera lens, the image being projected onto their drawings or their works of art or their paintings. They've also used, other instruments here to sort of then incorporate from either a fluted chalice or any other instrument, this sort of elongation or the sort of foreshortening aspect of a perspectival space with a smaller object, right? What would be in the foreground? Obviously, the sort of the tip of the instrument, and towards the back, it would get a lot smaller, right? Intuitively, we know it gets smaller. Part of what we're going to be doing is sort of then experimenting how in which you start to select some of these objects, but then also reincorporate through the arrangement of your still life. Here are some of these key artistic terms we're going to be looking at, which will be value, which is the element of art associated with the darkness or lightness of color. Grayscale, also known as achromatic grayscale, which is the collection or the range of monochromatic gray shades, ranging from pure white on the lightest end to pure black on the opposite end. We'll also look at light source, areas in which the light is originated from. Where's the light source coming from? Is it from the sky? Is it artificial light? Is it a candle? Is it multiple light sources? Is it dark? Is it too light? Where is it coming from, right? Contrast can be created through any differences, including value, color, texture, and size. And then finally, we have shadows, which are the areas of the objects where light does not hit. Okay. Now, those of you who want to experiment, because again, we're moving away from graphite, excuse me, you can kind of see here, you can start experimenting by creating your own grayscale. I will leave that completely up to you. It is not required, but if in order to sort of then kind of get more familiar before we start our preliminary drawings, I want us to sort of create a small grayscale either in our sketchbooks or actually on top of our drawing paper pads, if possible. Now let's look at another example of Giovanni Alberti's sort of study of a seated male nude from 1597 during the sort of a period of what we now look at in terms of mannerism. This is a great example of a gesture drawing. But the question is, what is a gesture drawing? A gesture drawing is a method of capturing a form and gesture of a figure quickly and expressively, right? And this is really important because it's really associated more with figuration in terms of the human body. Why? Because the human body is constantly moving. A good example would be to sort of, again, think about how artists will then focus on the pose and movement of a subject to draw the shape of the figure rather than focusing on the drawing the subject accurately or rendering any details. A good tool to remember is gesture is speed, quickly, right? You want to be very quick. Gestures associated with the timing and your speed of your mark, right? The faster the gesture, the quicker it is, the looser it is, right? And this is what I want us to sort of experiment first when we make our preliminary drawings. Good example of this would be to sort of looking at Egon Schiele's sort of gestural drawing of a portrait of a woman done in 1910. This is a colored lithograph. Quite remarkable to sort of see the line weight, but also the line quality of how loose, but also sort of how minute some of these line works that kind of indicate the form of this figure in the painting. I should say the print, excuse me. Marco Dante's sort of Laocoon and his sons being attacked by serpents is another great sort of rendition of looking at early Hellenistic Greek sculptures from antiquity, but also sort of learning from their contemporaries after the High Renaissance. This is a good example of what? A contour drawing. Why? A contour drawing is a drawing technique whereby the artist outlines the shape and mass of an object or subject. The main details and features are outlined, but the small details and value transitions are omitted. This is really important because the line work is actually more crucial and much more concentrated. That means what? Slower. A contour drawing is associated with the speed of how you pace yourself in terms of how slow you want to work, right? This is important when you start experimenting of what the difference of a gestural drawing would be and the ways of a contour drawing. And we're going to actually explore this in the actual demos themselves. Now, in mathematics, an ellipse is a plane curve surrounding two focal points such that for all points on the curve, the sum of the two distances to the focal points is a constant. So what does this actually physically mean? You can kind of see here from this globe that a student did from previous quarters gives us an idea of looking at an ellipse formed from different angles. It could be slightly above, straight on, slightly below, or an aerial perspective. An ellipse is an oval shape with a major and a minor axis crossing it at the center. The major and minor axes are two straight lines that are always at a 90-degree angle to each other. They divide the ellipse into 4 equal parts. The best way to remember this is that the first major axis, which will be the horizontal line, is usually the line that marks the longer piece. The major would be the one that goes vertical, up and down. So you can kind of see here this kind of sphere or this kind of plane on the actual globe itself. We know intuitively if we stood up and stood at the globe from an aerial perspective looking down, bird eye view, it would be round. But this is in perspective, right? This gives us the idea that it's sort of foreshortened. It curves and forms an ellipse, right? Now the trick is sort of then creating an actual ellipse form. Here are some of the steps of how to create an ellipse axis. First thing you want to do is create a horizontal line and vertical line that are perpendicular to each other. So what this means is that the horizontal line is sort of in the horizontal display, right? This is the major axis. The minor axis is in the vertical display. Notice here, if we saw an ellipse form, this gives us an idea of how it sort of should be shaped. The more and more we kind of see these examples gives us an idea of how foreshortened their angles are. They should always be at a 90-degree angle and where they meet. The lines create a major and a minor axis on the actual picture plane in order to create a proper ellipse form. This is really sort of part of what I want everybody to explore when you're using curves or more symmetrical objects in terms of spheres, anything that's round, a mug, an orange, a basketball, depending on where it is, right? This is really sort of then calculating through mathematical equations how we can use that towards our objects. Now, these are sort of examples of showcasing what you can do from different points of view. What I did here is create a small 3 by 3 inch square with a sort of series of diagonals indicating the center of this sort of square, but also then create a perfect circle. If you want to know how to create a perfect circle, this is what you would do. You would then divide it. You could even divide it into 8, but what I've done is sort of divide it into sort of 6 squares here. You have some like 6 smaller squares that are around 0.5 inches wide and tall. Gives us a sort of a connection between all of these series of dots, which I've made on the sketch here, but then I can kind of follow as a guide. Now, this only would apply if I was looking straight down on a flat three-dimensional object. Now, if the object itself was in perspective, this gives us more information, right? Gives us the height of the objects, the width of the objects, but the same rule applies, right? Now, if you can see here, there's a series of diagonals. This gives us an idea of what? How many perspectives do we see? 2, right? We have a series of orthogonal lines that meet to the right, and another series of orthogonal lines that meet to the left. But this also gives us more context of how high or how tall the physical object would be. Focusing on moving your shoulders and elbows. Do not move the pencil with your wrist. Instead, try to create oval motions as you draw your ellipse forms, okay? And what I mean by this is like the more and more I want you guys in the habit of looking at this as a sort of gestural drawing, the more then you can kind of go back and contour the form of the ellipse even clearly as a strong contour drawing. Now, a cross-contour drawing contains parallel lines that run across the surface of an object or radiate from the central point, such as those that appear on a topographical map or a digital wireframe. Now, this is interesting if we think about sort of looking at away from smudging. A series of cross contours are lines that give us that illusion of volume because they're sort of in that direction of what they're moving in, right? You can kind of see here on this example from another student's work from a previous quarter. Notice a series of hatching and what? Cross hatching. They overlap. Now, hatching is a series of vertical or horizontal lines in one direction only. Cross hatching is a series vertical and horizontal combined. And I want to sort of see how it would well we can then incorporate that, if possible, within our actual objects. Now, because we're working with sort of charcoal and not graphite anymore, we can kind of sort of see, we can, if possible, if we can do that with our charcoal materials. Let's look at some artist local references to give more context from looking at what the ideas of a still life should actually or ideally be. Still life with peaches in a water jar is a sort of a detail from the forced style wall of the painting frescoes in Pompeii, in sort of archaeological museum in Naples. Now, if we're looking more at more images from Pompeii, you can give us an idea of what their everyday life as well as their luxuries were from the objects that were being painted. And the more we understand this, we can kind of sort of see through representation, but also sort of visual analysis, how in which we can read some of the objects from our perspective. Caravaggio is really another fantastic high Baroque Italian painter who was actually wanted for murder in Rome, but also sort of really worked directly from observation to sort of dictate the sort of those intensities or the high contrasts that he creates when he made large-scale figurative paintings, but he also created some still lifes himself throughout his time as a painter. Salvador Dali's The Persistence of Memory is another good example of looking at the ideas of the Surrealist Manifesto, which sort of was coined towards Dali, but which was written by Andrea Breton, sort of the French writer and poet, gives us the idea of the conscious to the unconscious mind, of sort of thinking about the function and the roles of some of these objects in the ways that we think about surrealism. What is surrealism, right? It's a movement and a moment in time, and specifically in artists in the 1930s and 40s wanted to explore those sort of realms between reality and dreams, and sort of meshing those concepts together in terms of their writings as well as their works of art. Zayuji is a great example of looking at how we see the legacy, but also sort of the richness of our history of mankind from textbooks. And it's also remarkable to sort of incorporate some of the subtleties of how abstract some of these drawings are, but they're really actually much more representational of layers of newspaper as well as books on top of each other. Kofspernij is an artist from the Netherlands who uses more hyperrealism to sort of incorporate some of his images, but everyday mundane objects like a ketchup bottle, salt, pepper, shakers, but also sort of in a beautifully painted way. This is what I want you to get in the habit of. Look at what's around you. Looking at some of the objects you can be inspired by, right? Now, excuse me. Let's talk a little bit about what you're exactly going to be doing at home. Now, those of you who have your objects ready to go, what key thing I would always say is to please add some drapery, some fabric to sort of break the monotony as also sort of the flatness of the background. Why? Why would you do this? When you're arranging some of your objects, you want to almost build a sort of way of hierarchy, but also sort of more drama to sort of bring more depth, but also more playfulness in terms of playing more with value in the background itself. Within that, you can choose any fabric, any sort of drapery or sort of piece of material to sort of just pin on the wall and then sort of document your actual arrangement of the objects and then remove them. You can also sort of rearrange some of the fabric folds right? But also sort of place other objects underneath the fabric here. You can kind of see here that gives us sort of more height, more vertical space, which I highly recommend. There is no wrong way to set up a still life. Now, this is the same image documented in 3 different light sources, but this gives you an idea of how different the image can be when you just change your light source, which is quite interesting. Now, the natural light is showcasing, obviously, natural light that's coming from the right. Darkened light is where I sort of closed all the blinds, windows, and curtains. And then finally, we have our spotted light here, which was sort of aiming my spotted light directly on one side, which is the right, pointing to the left. It's vastly different, but it also gives you an idea, even using wrinkled, old paper, that it could actually symbolize a sculptural element. Through this, you will then select and sort of correct which actual image or orientation you would like to use throughout this assignment. Now, again, you have the complete option, complete freedom to choose any sort of orientation to your choosing. But remember, please do not forget, your orientation must be in the correct position, as well as the reference from the drawing. The portrait orientation refers to when the frame is in the vertical display. Landscape orientation generally refers to when the canvas orientation is a horizontal display. Your drawing should be in the same orientation from your reference. If your reference is in portrait orientation, then your drawing should be in portrait orientation, right? It cannot be mixed. If it is, it will look elongated. It will look too stretched out, right? So keep this in mind. Now let's talk a little bit about setting up your still lifes after adding your drapery fabric on the background. Now try to work with odd numbers like 3, 5, 7, and to sort of break up the sort of rules of just one object. Okay, you could work from objects from home when you're setting up your still life. Objects you could be using, it could be books, toys, fruits, vegetables, plants, flowers, pots, cups, flatware, etc. I will leave that up to you. But really, as soon as the composition is ready to go, you want to then sort of then start having fun with your light source, your direct light source. Where is it coming from, right? Start, playing around, pointing out sort of a table lamp, floor lamp, what have you, even your flashlight on your phones or your devices, and start to see how it starts to react on the surfaces from each materials of the objects. Move away, move close up, zoom in, zoom out, go to your left, go to your right, go top, bottom, what have you. Turn off your lights, turn them on, have some fun with building contrast, increasing the contrast, as well as the clarity for each shadow. The reason why I want us to do this is because, again, it sort of brings more interest towards that composition. Here's some of the examples that we've done in previous quarters, but also gives you an idea of what you can do with very limited objects, right? I want everybody to have fun, but also be specific, right? Try to find objects to have meaning to you, right? Try to find objects that have specific relationships to you, to the artist, nobody else, right? Because you almost want it to be a reflection upon being not only mindful to the composition, but also sort of organizing the drawing enough where it's sort of something of interest to you personally. Start by photographing in multiple images before finalizing your actual image, okay? Now, let's talk a little bit about the grid. Now, this is a separate grid from the Fibonacci sequence or the golden ratio, as well as the rule of thirds, okay? But let's talk about this. Now, the image that we're seeing here is sort of a photograph that we used before that I just arranged at home. And what I want us to do is sort of think about how we can use this grid to kind of speed up the drawing time in order to kind of map out a composition onto our drawings. Now, what do you have to do? You first want to draw a line from the bottom left corner to the top right corner. Secondly, you draw a line to the top left corner to the bottom right corner, which adds a sort of what? A perfect X in the center. Then you'll add a vertical line that runs through the center from top to bottom and a horizontal line that divides the reference into two, okay? This is where we found our center so far, okay? You will do the same thing for each square. So you'll do it here, you do it here, you'll do it here, and then you'll do it here. Once that's finalized, you then can potentially, I always say this in advance, please use your technology to your advantage. Change your saturation to black and white. Why? Because again, we're still working with a color range of black and white, monochromatic, right? You want to sort of build that achromatic grayscale, right? We're trying to find out where is that range of grayscale, what's medium, what's light, what's heavy, and so on and so forth. Through that, I want us to then sort of then start practicing with our preliminary drawings. But before so, if anybody has any questions about how to make a grid, please upload your reference under the assignment tab, and I'll actually I'll help you create a grid on my end, and then I'll send it back to you, okay? And we can do this soon after the lecture itself. Now, this is going to be one of the assignments we're going to be turning into this week. So for our 4 preliminary time drawings, before starting your final drawings, using painter's tape, create 4 separate squares onto the drawing paper pad, dividing them into 4 squares, okay? This process is to just sort of warm up your hand, right? This should take no more than half an hour, to be honest, okay? But why do we have to do this? Throughout this process, you're timing yourself and sort of getting this sort of the gesture of each actual object onto your sheet of paper. Only one sheet of paper. Keep this in mind. You're using one sheet of Strathmore paper, dividing it into 4, right? With some tape or a ruler, whatever's easier. I'm not interested in sort of the tape itself. It's just as a guide to help you to keep it clean. You could use a ruler. But really, I'm more interested to sort of see how fast can you map out your entire composition in 2 to 3 minutes, switching it then to 3 to 4, then 5 to 7, and then lastly, 8 to 10. Okay. Eventually, you should feel comfortable enough and then sort of then be inspired by the work in terms of what you want from the composition. These are almost acting like thumbnails in a way, in a larger way. But this helps you as a guide to sort of get familiar with what? The material. Remember, please only work with Willow charcoal, the soft charcoal, not the compressed, when you're creating your 4 preliminary drawings. You're only working with the Willow soft charcoal, not the compressed charcoal, which we'll go over in the demo. Eventually, it will look like this. And this gives you an idea of how the artist also, you can kind of see here remnants of the grid that they added on top of the image itself. But this gives you an idea of exactly what then eventually you will create. Let's look at some more examples, right? Here's another great example of showcasing another composition, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 5 to 7, 8 to 10. Excuse me, which eventually will then look like this. You will be redrawing the final without timing yourself, but also sort of then again being really methodical and really expressing the range of what you just learned from your gestural drawings as a strong contour drawing. So let's talk a little bit about what you're going to be submitting. Now we have 3 submissions for this assignment. One would be your well-documented 4 photographic references, 4 time preliminary drawings. That's 1 image. A well-documented photographic reference, and then finally your final still life arrangement, okay? These are the 3 things we're going to be submitting. Please, please, I cannot stress this enough. Tips and guidelines of how to document your work under the modules tab. Please review that link before you photograph your work. If I see shadows, you're going to be deducted. If I see, if it's too dark or not good enough quality, I'm going to have a conversation with you and sort of see if we can document it one more time. But really, it's your job as the artist to be mindful and do that beforehand before you submit your work. Let's look at some more examples. Now, this is a sort of a range of both on campus and then at home as well. But this gives you an idea of kind of diversifying different techniques and approaches to the work. I'll just sort of blaze through these here. What I also want you to sort of keep in mind is that you can focus on the minute, the small, the large. It's completely up to you. I always like to advise students too. They could also sort of intensify the darkness and lightness by adding just black to the background too, to really make their image pop, as well as some of their objects. Here's a great example of it on this image. Because imagine if all of that was white, right? The white of the paper. When you have this beautiful, rich layer of black, it kind of just makes everything else like sort of explode and kind of brings it to that foreground. Excuse me. This is what I don't want anybody to do. Having the glow of light. This tells me the student was too cautious to touch any of their objects, which is kind of funny. This was on campus. And that is the end of the lecture.